Hey, welcome back to our third installment of our three-part video series. So today we're just going to finish up Chapter 5. So first we're going to talk about the transportation revolution, and then we're going to talk about the technology of interchangeable parts. So the transportation revolution, which we discussed in some depth in the previous video, had a couple important aspects of it. First, it did require large-scale government investment. So if you read the book, you read that the turnpike boom was about 1/3 of it was funded by governments, mostly state and city governments. The canal boom, about 2/3 of that, the majority of that was funded by state governments and city governments. And the railroad boom was funded by states and also largely subsidized by the federal government, as a matter of fact. So why did transportation require so much government intervention? Well, because it has large, very, very large positive externalities, which we discussed in the previous video. Any good that has positive externalities will require government intervention, generally speaking. The argument's more nuanced than that, and there's a lot of things to consider. But if there's large-scale positive externalities, it's possible. It's not always the case, but it's possible that government intervention leaves society better off, leaves everyone better off. Okay, so that's the argument for that. And the transportation revolution was important for three main reasons. First, it made inputs viably cheap. So it made it possible to transport coal mined in North Georgia to the iron ore mines in Pennsylvania, and take coal and iron from Pennsylvania and Georgia to the foundries in Philadelphia or in New York, etc. All that required large-scale transportation. And also it made outputs viably cheap. And lastly, it greatly expanded access to the market. So before the transportation revolution, essentially what you had was you might have a big factory here and there, or a decent-sized factory, and it would generally be located in a city because they had to place it as close as possible to its market, to its final market, because of the high transportation cost. So you minimize the transportation cost by putting it close to your final market. But what that meant was that each factory was limited to just one city. It couldn't market across the state, and it definitely couldn't market across the country, and it definitely couldn't market overseas because transportation was too expensive. But with the transportation revolution, you could have one large factory based in, say, Cincinnati, and it could be selling to New York, to Chicago, to Atlanta, to Boston, to Philadelphia. It could market across the entire country, and eventually it could market to the entire world. Eventually, we were exporting goods to Europe and Asia and Africa, Latin America, etc. So the greatly expanded access to market had a very large secondary effect. If you recall, economies of scale are limited by the size of the market. If the market greatly expands, it's possible to use the most expensive modern machinery and to use a much finer division of labor to lower your production costs as far as possible. And the more you lower your cost, the more people can afford your good, the wider your market expands, the higher your profits go, the more efficient production becomes, and the more growth is generated for society, etc., with a lot of other ancillary effects down the line. Okay, so that's a really, really important point. That the expanded access to the market creates higher economies of scale. Okay, very important. In fact, I'm going to underline it in several different colors. Okay, but that's enough about transportation. Moving on, let's talk about the new technology, specifically the technology of interchangeable parts. If you read the book, you read that it was actually invented in Europe, in France or England, but it was basically the first country in the world to actually adopt the widespread use of interchangeable parts as a form of manufacturing was the United States. So it was an aspect of American innovation, more or less. So why was it important? Well, first, what is interchangeable parts? So interchangeable parts is in the 1700s, before the advent of interchangeable parts, if someone made a gun, he made every single piece by hand, and each piece was designed to only work with this one other unique piece. Each piece was custom made for that one item, and you could not take it out for that one item and put it on another identical item because it wouldn't work. It wouldn't fit. For example, in a modern car, you can take the engine out of any Honda Civic and put it into any other identical Honda Civic, and it'll fit and it'll work just fine because it's interchangeable. But in a custom-made horse-drawn wagon produced in 1700, if you took the axle off of that custom-made horse-drawn wagon and tried to put it on a different horse-drawn wagon, it wouldn't fit. It wouldn't fit the size of the bearings, it wouldn't fit the undercarriage, the wheels wouldn't fit, etc., because the parts were not made interchangeably. Everything was made uniquely and custom by hand. So the important thing about interchangeable parts is that it creates the possibility for a very fine division of labor. Because now, you can have one person in charge of just making one part. So you could have one worker just making identical cogs, and the next person making some identical axles, and the next person making a clock face. And then when you put everything together, you get a clock. And then you could have someone assembling them very quickly, rather than one person, or a small team, whatever, making each unique piece to fit each unique clock. So it creates economies of scale and drastically lowers cost. It's really hard to understate how big of an impact that had. And also, interchangeable parts had some other long-term effects. So lowered production costs, and importantly, it made the United States competitively internationally and domestically. That was the technological breakthrough that the United States needed, and not in every sector, but in most sectors, in order to become competitive and to have a competitive manufacturing sector. It allowed for much finer division of labor. But some of the really important long-term effects were that it laid the foundation for the mass manufacturing industrial economy of the United States that would eventually dominate the world. It laid the foundation for Henry Ford to start building his Model T. It laid the foundation for Boeing. It laid the foundation for Carnegie Steel, etc. All these giant megaliths of the American economy could not exist without interchangeable parts. But it also had some really important tertiary effects. For example, the de-skilling of labor, which I mentioned in the 2 videos ago. But one of the effects of the use of interchangeable parts is the de-skilling of labor. Because now, instead of being a skilled artisan that has to be able to make each piece for an entire item and put it together, now you can just be a semi-skilled worker who knows how to do a few simple operations to make one piece. And you only make one piece, and you don't know anything about the other pieces. You don't know how to assemble it. You're just making one piece. It makes that possible. So what that does is that lowers the cost of labor, because now you don't need skilled labor. Now you just need a semi-skilled worker who is disposable. Okay, and that's important, which means it makes it possible to use low-skilled immigrants who don't even have to speak the language. It makes it possible to use very small children. It makes it possible to use part-time women workers who are not necessarily skilled artisans, etc. in the 1800s. Okay, and it also makes possible the use of large-scale machinery. So it would take a very complicated machine to make all the parts and assemble a clock by itself. But it was very possible, even in the 1800s, to start making large-scale machines that could make one part a piece. Okay, so the use of machinery became much more feasible and widely applicable once parts were not being custom made, once they were being made in a standardized fashion. Okay, so large-scale machinery became much more feasible as a result, and you had a finer specialization of labor. All of these led to much higher economies of scale. Economies of scale. And now modern factories look like this. Row upon row of, literally, the biggest factories in the world have over 1 million employees. Foxconn, the Taiwanese company that operates in Taiwan and China has over 1 million employees because they have such a fine specialization of labor and use of machinery, etc., that they have extremely low cost. They are one of the lowest cost producers in the world. That's why they're so popular and so big, and why they make all the Apple products. And they also make some Samsung products and etc. Okay, so that's it for today's class. I hope you guys have enjoyed this 3-part lecture series. So you can close the video and do quiz 3 now. And see you in class on Tuesday.